Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. We don't quite know when you will be watching this. It's a conversation between myself and a colleague and friend, the Reverend Dr. Lindsay Armstrong. She is the Executive Director of New Church Development, which in South Africa we call an NPC, a not-for-profit company. And it's working with churches and working with the Presbytery of Greater Atlanta. And who else, Lindsay, to work in this area of New Church Development?
Yeah, with all of the Presbyterian Church USA folks across the nation. It's the 1001 movement or initiative. They keep going back and forth on what the name will be. But we work all across the whole nation, but I'm located in Atlanta. So greetings from Atlanta.
Great, and it's lovely to see you and be with you in this conversation. And we're going to be talking about 6 shifts. And 6 shifts in what, Lindsay?
Well, shifts in mindset, shifts in posture. At least the church around here has been dealing and reaching for methods and what's working in the church for about 2 decades. And what we're starting to realize is we can look for methods and best practices all day long, but they're not leading to a lot of change. Instead, there's these shifts in posture and the shifts in the way that we are that are really starting to make a difference and that are called for in the new era that we are at the beginning of.
Great. And we're hoping that this conversation will raise some issues, create some opportunities, change some mindsets for pastors, ministers in the Southern African context, particularly in the Presbyterian Church here in Southern Africa. And that's why we're doing this workshop. So perhaps we can begin by talking about what has caused us to be in this place? Why is this a relevant topic right now? And I know we can think of obvious reasons, but let me hear what you think. Why is it a good thing to talk about now?
I think that we are in a moment when the shifts upon us are more seismic than usual. There's always change going on, no matter what. You have to change just to stay even, stay afloat, stay strong. But right now, we are leaving behind, the way I would phrase it at least is, we're leaving behind an industrial era, and there is something new upon us that is changing the entire world, not just the church. It's changing markets, it's changing the way we behave in our personal lives, and that is access. And access has really revolutionized the way we do life, the way we do church, the way we do business, the way we do our buying. I think I will spend Christmas this year not purchasing from a physical store. We have other kinds of access thanks to technology. Yeah. And this notion of access is really impacting the church. And so I'm beginning to see it as we're moving from an age of institutions to an age of access. It's one of many ways you could describe it, sure, but that's... Yeah.
But and I think we here in Southern Africa can relate to that in a profound way, especially as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic. We have been almost we've been forced into this age of access because the only access we have to our congregations is through social media, through using YouTube clips, through writing letters through email and sending things through WhatsApp and all of these things. And for many of our churches, they will have either never used those platforms before, or they would have used it very sparingly, but it's been accelerated dramatically. And so I think what's kind of interesting for us, apart from talking about the missional issues, is to think about post-COVID-19, do we go back to normal? What's normal now? As people have experienced this access, they've also experienced the variety of other offerings that are available to them. And of course, we've got many ministers watching this and church leaders who are saying, will anybody ever come back to church again? When we have the first in-person service, is anybody going to be there? So access, I think, is vitally, vitally important. But carry on a little bit about this change and so on.
Yeah. Well, one small thing I'd love to just toss in. One of the communities that I work directly with 27 different new worshiping communities here in Atlanta. One of the communities during the pandemic has actually, 7 of them have become international, but one has actually gone on the radio in order to have access to people without internet access. And I think those kinds of changes will stay for a long time. But I think that I think that we're in a unique moment. Change is always happening in the church and in our lives, but I actually think we're in a unique moment that's a little bit different than the regular kinds of change we always experience.
Yes.
Most of us imagine evolution as this slow, steady, progressive change. And what biologists now recognize is that evolutionary development is marked not by slow, steady change, but instead by isolated episodes of rapid speciation between long periods of, from the big picture, little or no change. Now, there's lots of change on the ground, but it's the kind of change that keeps the equilibrium, that keeps you kind of roughly where you are at the same level of fitness and health. But biologists now recognize that evolutionary development, it's not slow, steady change. It's isolated periods of rapid, rapid, rapid change between long periods of little or no change. And it's called punctuated equilibrium.
Yes.
And in this new world, not to paint too broadly or make it too simplistic, but in this new world, whenever we have these moments of punctuated equilibrium, like we did 500 years ago with the printing press, in this new world, there, like the dinosaurs, are many who are incapable of surviving in the newfound ecosystem. An ecosystem is changing, and when an ecosystem changes, what life forms know, what we know, corresponds to reality that no longer exists.
Yes.
And as I've already suggested, I think the asteroid that has hit our world is access
Right.
to markets, technology, each other, etc.
Great. And I think that's some of what our participants in this workshop will be able to relate to. Some have read Alan Hirsch, where he talks about an adaptive challenge. So something comes up, and if we can adapt, we become greater as an organism than what we were. And if we can't, we die. And I worry about many of our churches because I think in some ways we sentimentalize the gospel and even church, and we say, all right, if only we did it good enough, if only we work hard enough, or if only we deliver on that old story of Jesus and his love, as the old hymn goes, then everything's going to be fine, and God will be faithful, and he will provide. And we only need to be faithful in response to that. And I don't know that is enough, because I think faithfulness may require of us to be ready to adjust, to change, not the message, but the methods that we use. And I think that's why this workshop is so important for those who are participating in it, is to explore the changes. And as you say, it's not a slow and easy process. It's a bang, and we have to do something to survive.
Yeah, and that is, I think you're raising a great point there, George. I think the temptation really is to just try to buckle down, work harder, do better. And what's required now is not doing more or better relative to what we know, to the known world, but a willingness to learn the nature of the new world and engage in redesigning ourselves to thrive in that environment. That is the task facing the 21st century church.
And of course, you and I will have experienced a tremendous amount of change over the course of our lives. I was talking just now about this little thing I found on the internet about things that haven't changed in the last, 25 years or so. The Lion King has always been on Broadway. People under 25 have never licked a postage stamp. Princess Diana, Jacques Cousteau, Mother Teresa have never been alive. Hong Kong has always been under Chinese rule. And hybrid automobiles have always been mass-produced. Well, that is not the case with us. We remember times where we didn't have cell phones growing up necessarily. And I don't know when in America the first cell phones came, but I can remember it was in the, I think the mid-90s that the cell phone emerged on the scene. And so people weren't available 24/7. If they weren't home, you didn't get them on the phone. So there has been a tremendous amount of change in our lives, and sometimes we just have imagined it to be linear and the same.
Sure. And I think this one, I mean, I didn't want my first cell phone. I did not want to be that available. My husband had to give it to me as a present that I did not want, but then I loved it. And now, yeah. And this kind of change, it's, I think now the kinds of change are really about fundamental transformations in mindset, in outlook, posture, way of being, because there are contrasting assumptions. I mean, this thing you found on the internet about 25-year-olds, they have experienced the church in several distinctive ways, at least in my context they have.
Yes, yes.
And their experience of church doesn't match with what they're looking for quite often. Can't
Right.
paint all the way across. And there are these, what I'd never expected in my research. So I've been working with new worshiping communities, directly with new worshiping communities, coaching, training, etc., for 7 years now. And I've spent 6 years doing doctoral research with some fantastic professors who coached me along on the phenomenon of new worshiping communities. They're also different. And what I kept being surprised about were, no matter how different they were, no matter who and what kind of community it was, there were these shifts in outlook. There were these shifts in ways of being that were simply distinctive from the ways that the existing churches were functioning. And that is where I found about 10 of them. Actually, we boiled it down to 6, so that George and I get to talk with you about today. And the purpose behind it is not to provide any sort of a how-to or prescription to follow. The purpose is to start a conversation, and for you not to walk away with all these ideas about what you'll do, but to actually walk away committed to starting some conversations about the questions that are emerging from you based on what you hear with other people outside of the people who might be gathered around this Zoom conversation.
And I think, Lindsay, it's also important to point out, right up here at the start, before we get into the detail of the thing, is that I think what we're talking about here today is important when looking at new worshiping communities, and the prospect of trying something new as an established congregation. You might want to reach out and start something new. But it's also important, I think, in terms of ethos for the established church. The established church's ethos is going to have to change, and fast. And these are very helpful pointers to looking at how those things might, the ethos will have to change.
Yeah, these aren't things that need to change for a lot of the new worshiping communities I work with. They're already there. This conversation is definitely, for me and for you and for all of us who have who are part of the churches that are already established. We have ways of being and things, ways of doing things, many of which are fantastic and work, and some of which need to be adjusted and at least engaged and asked questions about. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to talk. You're going to help us to look at the established church and the way in which things were going back in the church we remember, the church that we've been part of, and then you're going to contrast that with what you see as characteristics of the emerging stroke new worshiping communities, where structures and mindsets, and you call them postures, I think, which I think is a great way of referring to them. They're different, and we'll see the difference between those two models. So where do we start?
So one of the first shifts that really jumped out at me as I spent year after year being a part of new worshiping communities and also interviewing a ton of the leaders, almost 100 different communities are who I engaged. And I was just trying to understand the phenomenon. I certainly wasn't looking for this. But one of the themes that just jumps out at me from the very beginning, and stay with me here, because I think that you might not love the way I phrase it at first, but just stay with me if you will, please. I would be a big favor. One of the biggest shifts that I saw is that we've moved from churches in the age of institutions, at least in the United States, and that's all I can speak about. I'm sorry. I'd love to be in Southern Africa right now and meeting you all, but this is an opportunity we have thanks to Access. One of the big shifts is in the age of institutions, churches started or sustained in response to demand. And now, in an age of access where people have a lot more opportunity to go many places, they are really starting and sustaining, and I think in the case of existing churches, flourishing insofar as they offer deep meaning that people need in their lives. So back in my context, at least, in the 50s and 60s, there was this chapter in the North American church, and I'm very curious. I think it might be true for Southern Africa as well. It certainly seems to be true for other conversations, partners I have in other countries.
Yes.
But back in the 50s, 60s, there was a chapter in the church's life when demand for church outstripped supply. I was reading this book by Gil Rindle, and he's a Methodist in the States, and he wrote this book called Quietly Courageous, Leading Church in a Changing World. And he has this fantastic quote, which is actually laced with quotes that he took from the front page of the New York Times of its day. And he's arguing that the strength of Christianity in this era, in an institutional era, rested on the foundation of swift demographic growth. And he writes that, hang on, I probably need to get that quote out. He writes that the kind of steady linear increase that most churches were accustomed to, it gave way in the 50s and 60s to the surge in membership and attendance that left denominations and parishes struggling to match supply to newfound demand. Now, this is before we were even born. This is a hard thing to imagine, and this is the quote: "Church memberships grew faster than population growth. Enrollments in seminaries and Sunday schools increased steadily. There was a great surge in church construction. In this country, Americans spent $26 million on sacred architecture in 45, $409 million in 1950, and $1 billion constructing churches and church buildings in 1960. And that memory still captures a lot of our church leaders. And it's this memory of growth and strength and having to run to catch up with this wave of people who are ready to join and be active participants in the life of a church. And that was a very short-lived moment. And so what we had was church as the place to be. And so we accommodated it. And what was needed was to be a faithful, healthy, well-organized Christian church in an adequately populated area.
Right.
Now, the scaffolding upon which we can build our lives is wider ranging. And we have to, as leaders, have this sense and respond posture that discerns particular needs, that offers meaning. Demand matters. You can't not have that. There needs to be genuine interest in church, but that's kind of the price of admission. It's the starting point. Now we have to offer this profound, specific meaning. And I see churches doing this, but it jumped out at me with the new churches. Every single one that I talked to that was thriving had a very particular sense of call. They were clear about their church vocation. This community called Oikos provides home, a sense of home, for international students from particularly South Korea, but Asian countries, to come together and have an experience of home while they are studying abroad. A church called Ormwood Church. They are feeling very called to deeply neighbor, to love your neighbor as yourself. And what they do all pivots around that. I talked to a ton of communities, Shalom, Soul Soup, others, that are all working for healing and for a certain kind of healing in their community. Others are bridging generational divides between different immigrant communities. The list can go on. Others are kind of activists. The list could go on, but they're all creating this deep meaning. They are clear on what meaning, or it's clear to the people who might become a part of the community, what meaning being a part of that community creates in their life, what possibility it opens up in their life and in the larger world. And it's really kind of getting clear on the sense of vocation that a particular community, a church community has. Is this resonating?
Yes, it does resonate, Lindsay. And I'll tell you, it resonates on a number of levels. Firstly, I'm sure that those who are tuned into this workshop will know of huge building projects that happened across the Presbyterian Church in a similar time, to this. And secondly, times when the church, and probably a season a little longer than the US season, or a little later. So in other words, we have gone on a little longer with Christendom Church, where it was easy because people just rolled in. They brought their children for baptism. They came to get married in the church, and they get buried out of the church. And those things were just normal and ordinary, and everybody did them, and so on. And so people will be able to relate to that completely, demand outstretching supply. But we can also relate to what you're talking about with regard to a very different landscape now. And in fact, when I went to that conference with you last October, I came back, and in my report, two of the things that I wrote up about the experiences I'd had in the conference in Pittsburgh and so on, in New York City, was the first one is church around a table, hospitality being at the center, the meal being at the center, which probably is something Oikos does, and many of the other churches do, dinner church and so on. And then meaning making, absolutely significant theme. Everybody that you ask, they have something that their group is wanting to do together. And it's a godly thing, and it's a kingdom thing. And so it's not a sort of fad or a fashionable thing, but it is I don't want to call it a niche, but it's something that people kind of hang on to and say, this is what we do, and we find significant. And we find that also in the Fresh Expressions Church across the world, Alzheimer's walks, eco things, and so on. Doing meaningful things is something that can draw people together. And I think you've seen this as a feature.
Yeah, I think of it as vocation, churches discovering their particular vocation. And just to be clear, just because I'm drawing this distinction and this shift between, in the institutional era, churches started and sustained in response to demand, and in the age of access, they start and respond in response to meaning. That doesn't mean they didn't get meaning back in the day. They did. It's just that the meaning was far more obvious because they were a natural and a given center point piece of the culture of the community. And now it's far more vocationally tied. People want to come together around an issue of justice that they believe God is calling them to be a part of in the world. And so they want to be with people with whom they can stand side by side and protest or write letters or, be fed, worship, study, go back out, come back in, or healing, or you name it. But yeah, this meaning piece is very prominent.
Okay.
And I think what it does is it gives people access to know why in an era or an age when it might not be as obvious why to come to church, it helps people know, oh, if I go there, and the sky's the limit because God is at work in so many different ways, but they know what kind of meaning it brings to their life. And it gives them an entry point, an access point that is harder to see if it's just a church for everyone that does everything. And there's a lot of good sentiment behind that, but the particularity is very, well, it's hard work. It takes a lot of discernment, but it's very compelling because we know God is on the move doing so many things. In a lot of the new immigrant churches here, I mean, part of it really is to provide a safe landing space, home, community, and taste of home from yesterday. And this is really important. It's key. People need it in their lives. Yeah. And it's one of the things God's doing.
Just remind us of some of those stories again. So Oikos is that a Korean church or yeah? And that people are looking for experiences of home. And Oikos, of course, the Greek word for household or home. So what do they do?
Yeah, so this is one that's largely engaged with international students on campuses in the Atlanta area.
Yes.
And the organizing pastor actually started this church through his own experience of being an international student. He was studying at Columbia Theological Seminary and an international student and missing the taste and flavors of home, the language of home, the sounds and smells of home, the people. And he didn't have transportation to get out to the Korean communities and the areas in Atlanta. So he walked along the campuses, saw students in undergraduate students or graduate students in larger universities in the same situation. Now they have bento box church on Thursdays where they gather around bento boxes for lunch, and they have a worship service that starts liturgy, then they break bread together, then they end with communion, and they, sing, they do a full worship service. They have Friday night Bible studies. Once a month they go to the refugee section of town. So again, they understand the experience of feeling homeless, of feeling disconnected, and they do a lot of service projects with other organizations and churches in the area. They go on a quarterly retreat where they get away, and they are in the organizing pastor's home a good bit, which is quite a trick because he has a wife and 2 kids, and they have a 2-room apartment, and the whole community piles in, but it's a taste of home. And so they do these kinds of things. Ormwood is a church that's built into the middle of a neighborhood, and they have a physical space, and they have decided to use it to really engage the question of what it means to love God and neighbor. And they read books together, but their book clubs are not in the building. They're on porches or on the lawn of the church so that they can be seen and visible and accessed so that neighbors feel like they could come if they wanted. They set up a dog park on a little tiny patch of their land. They host the Meet the Makers Festival for the community. It's a festival where people who make homemade items come and show how they do it and sell their wares. They are intentionally engaging questions of gentrification and what it looks like to neighbor and to be a neighborhood, to be a community of neighbors. They are engaged in, but they deeply neighbor. That is their meaning, their purpose. And the first meeting we ever had to figure out if we should even try and start this church resulted in 100 neighbors coming together, most unexpectedly, and finding out that, and meeting people for the first time who lived 3 doors down. Wow. Or who lived across the street. And they realized that they were just so isolated and alone and estranged from each other. And so this kind of, learning to neighbor intentionally, if they read the book, The Art of Neighboring, this is their particular vocation as a church.
Right. And that's a deeply biblical principle, isn't it?
It is.
To become a neighbor and to be part, incarnational in the community in which God has placed us. Oh, that's lovely. Okay, good. So we need to move on. First, just to remind those who are workshopping with us, so the age of institution, churches responding to a demand and sustained by the demand, but now in the age of access, as you've called this, and you talked about what kind of access we're talking about, churches are sustained and started in response to offering meaning. They have to offer meaning in order for people to come, and people kind of relate to that, or they don't relate to that. They choose, I guess, their worshiping community by the vocation, the calling, the meaning. Not so.
Yeah. Okay. Nicely said.
Should we go on to the next one?
We should. Can I just say? Can I just say one thing? Yeah. Yes. I think for us, the classic phrase that summed up the institutional era maxim: "If you build it, they will come." In the emerging age, there's no shortage of access. I mean, right now in the middle of this pandemic, we have people worshiping with churches halfway around the world because they want to. People everywhere can find a church, locally, internationally. In this emerging age, the question is whether they will find a church that points them to the living God and the deeply meaningful work that God is doing, or that they sense God wants to be doing in their lives.
Right. Good. I guess part of that, Lindsay, is, or part of the challenge is to communicate well. That's going to be important. We can have all the calling in the world and, all the meaningful projects, but if we don't articulate those in an inviting way and allow people to see the importance of those, that might also be pointless.
Yes. And that's, Yeah, and that's a brilliant liaison. It's a brilliant setup into the second shift.
Okay. What's the second shift?
And they're in no particular order, by the way. There's not one
Yep.
that's more important. These are just shifts that are designed to start a conversation in your own communities. But they are shifts, and these are things I saw in virtually all the new communities, and it would be interesting to see where we see them in the existing communities too, but because I'm sure they're there as well, but they just get there's stark contrasts. Second shift. In the age of institutions, and this is almost the definition of an institution, there was hierarchical, very centralized decision making. We knew what worked, and here are the systems and the people that are going to make it happen. In an age of access, there is a definite bent and gravitation toward decentralized participatory decision making and mass collaboration. And jump in, but I have an interesting story about this that really was the eye-opener for me.
Okay, carry on.
Okay, in that case, I will. So shortly, about a year into my work with New Worshiping Communities, our presbytery came to me and said, we have a church that's closing. We can either sell the building or you can start a new community in it. What would you like to do? I was thrilled they asked, and I said, I don't know. Because I didn't know. I mean, if the church is closing in this particular area, there's a reason for it, and people might not be interested. I asked them for a few months to go and do discernment work, and then to come back and let them know. And our presbytery, we don't want to be property owners or property managers, and yet nonetheless they said yes. This was a game changer. I went in, I had been trained as a community organizer, and I went in and I knew one person in this whole community, and not very well at that. And so I got in touch with this one person, took him to coffee, and had all of these, in what community organizing they would call one-to-one relational meetings. And these are 30-minute, 40-minute, in my case, meetings where you sit down with somebody and it's developing a professional relationship. It's, hi, who are you? Tell me about what you do. Why? What are the themes that, why is this really important to you? It was to find out about this community and the leaders in it. And I did this I logged over 90 hours doing this. And the leaders, by the way, are not just titled leaders. I mean, it's also the person who sits on their front porch and knows everything that happens in that neighborhood. That person's definitely a leader. The leader is the person on the playground who says, hey, y'all, let's do this. And everybody follows them and does it. Leaders, followers. Yeah. So long story short, tons of one-to-one meetings. At that time, it seemed possible. I wasn't asking anybody if we should start a church. I was just trying to get to know the neighborhood and try to gain a sense of what God was already doing in this neighborhood and whether we were called to be a part of it. So set up this community conversation after 3 months of doing the one-on-one conversations. I did not advertise well. I didn't want to. I did not create a post. I used no GIFs. I did no graphic design. I just sent an email to all the leaders I had met and said, hey, community conversation. If you know anybody who would want to be there, just send the email to them. I booked a coffee house for this. And then 1 week before, the coffee house canceled. I wanted to do it in the coffee house because starting a new church didn't necessarily mean we'd use the old building. And I wanted to indicate that.
Yes.
The coffee house told us that they canceled because they wouldn't be able to fit everybody. I didn't really believe them. And so nonetheless, didn't have any choice. The only other place, we moved to the fellowship hall of the church that was closing. We set up for 40 people. I was really hoping for 20 people. I was expecting maybe 12, and over 106 people gave me their email address by the end of the night. What happened in that meeting is we did not ask them, hey, y'all, should we start a church? Instead, we asked them community organizing questions. Tell us about your community. What do you love about it? Map your community. Draw a map on the piece of butcher paper that's on the table in front of you. It's interesting to see what people see and don't see. Where do you want this community to be in 10 years? And what are the challenges facing this community? Well, the meeting was electric. When we joined back to the large group, there was an interesting shift in the dynamics. Up until then, conversation had been lively. People were loving the chance to get to know each other. There was a lot of interesting observation. In the large group time, a couple of good questions. This guy raises his hand and says, just tell us what you're going to do with the building. Another person echoed in and said something similar. Just tell us what you've already decided. I don't understand why we're here tonight.
Right.
And all these people started basically communicating that they expected that we as the church had already decided without them. That we had a group of people somewhere in some room that had already determined the outcome.
Because that's what we do. That's what we do. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. I mean, we used to start churches by planning them out in a meeting room that wasn't even in the neighborhood and didn't use the people that the church would be there for. Yeah. Well, in the end, we did our best. And because I'd already built all these relationships, we did our best to say, we're just having a conversation. We don't know what we're going to do. And we are simply trying to discern with you the dynamics and needs of this community. And at the end of the meeting, here's what happened. One person. Hi, that was a great meeting. Thank you. I'm going to have about 30, 40 people over to my house to discuss whether we should start this church. Can you make it next week? Now, we had never even asked if we should start the church, right? Another person contacted me a week later, did not know that person, and I couldn't make it, by the way, I was out of town, so they went ahead and had the meeting without me. Another person a week later said the same thing. Hi, we have a bunch of young adult couples. We'd like to have a meeting on the playground at the church to discuss whether we should start this church or not. They were not connected at all with the other group. That night, I got an email from somebody who was young, 20-something, who said, and these words are seared into my memory. I don't know who I am spiritually. I don't know where I fit into the church. I don't even know what I think about God. But what I do know is that I need what happened in that room tonight. Wow. And if you want help starting this new church, I'm in.
Wow. I mean, that's an incredible response to a sheer act of vulnerability, coming in without a plan, saying, let's see, let's ask, and I think we should do more of that as the church. We think that we're in opposition to empire with its violence and, decisions apart from us, but we're not. We've become our worst enemy. We need to unlearn those ways of being. Yeah. But that is a fantastic response.
Yeah. Well, and it was the decentralized participatory decision-making that empowered and galvanized this community. I mean, it embodied something that they already saw in the faith, but that they needed in their lives. And with that one move, opening the doors, decentralizing the decision-making, and making the conversation participatory,
yes,
we changed the balance of power, and they noticed. And I do think that if we want to rebuild public trust in our churches, we have to let people get their hands on them.
Right.
I mean, the real reason people don't trust institutions is that institutions do not trust them. We offer these occasional, insubstantial, often frustrating opportunities to take part, while decisions that matter are actually made by a few people over here and often behind closed doors.
Wow.
And so in this moment, it was the participatory decision-making, the mass collaboration. They wanted a seat at the table. They wanted access. They wanted their giftedness affirmed. And it promotes ownership, investment, and makes us connected.
That's great.
I could go on. I will stop. Almost launched into a sermon there. Sorry, folks.
I think that's wonderful. And that's a great, the story helps us to understand this need for a movement, away from and towards, to put the faith and the life of the church back into the hands of members or people who are not yet members, who are keen to have access to spiritual life, to community, to spiritual conversations. So that's absolutely great. So what do we want our workshop folk to talk about, Lindsay? We're having an interactive session after this video clip. What are the kinds of questions that we want them to talk about, just broadly speaking?
I think a conversation about how access is impacting your church, either access to markets, to technology, to other churches, to one another. That is an interesting thing. By calling it an age of access, I'm not trying to say that's the only title, but I do think it's a shift that is impacting us in ways we do need to explore. But other than that, I do think exploring these shifts. What ways are you seeing these shifts at work in your own churches? I am not saying they're only happening in new worshiping communities. They are happening across the board, but what ways could they be happening more? What ways are we seeing them? And what might it look like if we were to lean into these mindsets? And the interesting thing is that at the end of my research, I found that I found a guy in the business world who consults for major Fortune 500 companies like Facebook. And he actually wrote this little pamphlet where he outlined some of the same shifts that we were seeing in the business world. So this isn't just something that's happening in the church. These are shifts in mindset and posture and way of being that are happening everywhere. And so people do expect them in the church. Right. So I think starting to explore the question of how, of where you do see these shifts taking place and what might it look like in your own community and what might the benefits or the drawbacks be from those. You can't shift completely away, but infusing our church life with more of these very called for postures. Actually, if we can see the postures and consider them, I think we become, and use them sometimes, I think we become more enabled to address the matters that we define as problems in our own churches, just with the mindset shift. And it shapes how we go about. So those are the questions I would ask.
Excellent.
What would you ask?
Well, I think pretty much the same thing. I would add, the only thing I would add to that is to explore a little bit some of the possibilities in the area of meaning making, of call, vocation. I'd want to hear from some folk what they think might be some options in that regard, and in what places would churches in our Southern African context find vocation in the community? Because often we are quite apart from the community. There's the church life on the one hand, and then on the other hand, there's the community, and they don't really meet. But they could be related to some of the challenges that the community faces. Or they could be almost like working on an oasis in the midst of, of a community. So that would be interesting. But let's see what comes up. It's been great having this first conversation. And I'm looking forward to the interactive session. So see you just now.
Take care. Bye-bye.